Okay, so we're back with block 4 of Behind the Blocks, which is the beautiful ribbon star block. Now, I had never made this block before, I know, but I really liked it when I saw it, and I just love that it's just so simple to make. When you break this block down into its core components, it's basically a half square triangle and a background square, and that's it. Now, we've already made 3 blocks using half square triangles, so we're starting to become pros at this, so this should be very easy. In this video though, you're going to see me do something that you've never seen me do before, and it's quite controversial, and some people will not be happy. Other people will not care. Whichever side of the fence you fall on, I hope you enjoy it, and I will explain what it is later on. The one thing I do want to emphasize though about this block is that half square triangle units make up lots of quilt blocks, and you can do lots of intricate things using them. The problem that we face is that as there is more and more of them in the quilt, and as they get smaller, there are more and more seams to deal with, which means there's more and more bulk. So getting things to line up, getting crisp points, and getting seams to stay flat becomes more and more of a challenge the more of them that we have. In this block, there are, 12 half square triangles, and out of, no, hang on. Yes, 12 half square triangles out of the 16 pieces that make up this block. That's 3/4 of the block composed of these blocks, so there are a lot of seams on the back of this. We need to do things as quilters to try and minimize this because A, we want our blocks to line up because we want sharp points. We also want them to be the right size, but we don't want big bulky lumps in the block as we're trying to quilt because presser feet on the sewing machine get stuck, things can be pushed, and so it makes it harder to make the block accurately. So I'm pressing my seams open. Now, before you unsubscribe, hear me out. Pressing the seams open helps to keep the bulky seams flat. It makes it easier for them to go through the sewing machine. It makes them easier to spread the bulk. If you are opposed to pressing your seams open, I would love for you to come at this with an open mind and just see how it turns out, okay? Think of it a bit like spinning the center seam of a pinwheel to distribute the bulk. It's like that, okay? I will say, however, though, if you don't want to press your seams open, that is absolutely 100% fine. I am not offended at all. You press your seams however you like and however makes sense, but just be aware that the instructions are based on pressing the seams open. So enough waffle, let's just get straight to making the block. So here we are with the preparations for the ribbon star block. And just like our previous videos, it begins with half square triangles. Now, I have done some prep work in advance to save you watching all that footage again. I will explain it, but if you want more detailed footage, go back and review the previous videos because I do talk about this in much more detail. So we start with our 3 colored squares in blue and our 3 colored squares in yellow with our 6 background squares. These are for later on, so let's get rid of them just now. With your background fabric on the wrong side, you're drawing a line from corner to corner on each of the 6 squares. Doesn't matter what pen or what you use to mark, nobody will see this line. You're going to cut on this line, so it's going to be invisible. Today, because it was the only thing I could find, I used a Frixion pen, but as I say, it doesn't really matter. Any pen will do because nobody will see this line. So on all 6 of them, draw your line corner to corner, then take them and place them right sides together and pin. Now, a great little tip to save you having to pull pins out of the sewing machine because they get stuck under the foot is to put the pins in the corner away from this line because you are going to be sewing a 1/4 inch on either side of this line, and you don't want the pins getting stuck on the presser foot because then you have to stop and it makes it take longer. So put in the corner and that gets them out of the way. When you've done that for all of these, we are going to chain piece these through the sewing machine. What that means is we're going to take them and sew a 1/4 inch of the line on each of these. And then when we get to the end, we're going to insert a little scrap of fabric and then we're going to cut these off, spin them around and then sew a 1/4 inch on the other side of the line and chain piece them all back through the sewing machine. So let's do the sewing. Okay, so we have now sewn them all. You saw me chain piecing them. By all means, if you are not comfortable sewing them like that, do these one at a time. sew these however you feel most comfortable. This is just the most efficient way to do it when they're all joined. So you can see I get this long little chain of pieces. Now, got a little blade saver here. We're going to just, first of all, snip them apart by cutting the threads. Next, take out all your pins. Now, you can see there is a little bit of wobble in that seam. Not wobble, but there's just a little bit of a pucker in the fabric, just from the tension of the stitches in the fabric. So we iron this flat, and the heat helps that to relax so that they're nice and flat for cutting. So all we need to do is just take these, take the iron, run it over, and it will relax the fabric. Now, because these are friction pens, the lines have disappeared. And yes, this is the second time I'm pressing these because I forgot to press record the first time. So I'm just doing it to show you, but just give them a quick press. It's really just to get them to lay nice and flat. Now let's trim these. Okay, now as I mentioned, you're going to cut on the line and cut these into two. However, as I used the friction pen, the line has disappeared. Now this doesn't really matter because this is just the seam allowance, so it's not too important. If you have a line there still, you can either cut with scissors along the line, or you can take a rotary cutter and you can use a ruler and cut them in half. Doesn't really matter as long as you get a 1/4 inch beside the sewn line because it's the seam allowance. What I'm going to do, since I'm an idiot and forgot about the pen, is I'm going to take just a normal square ruler. It has a 1/4 inch line, so I'm just going to line that up on the sewing line and then just cut these in half like that. And so you get, there's the seam there, and then there's a 1/4 inch of fabric. So either way, however you do this, it doesn't need to be too accurate. Cut along your line or use your ruler and cut them in half. And repeat for all of these. And then we're going to go and press them. There are quite a few seams in this block and it can get a little bulky. So with the dark color on top, we're going to press the seam, we're going to open it so the seam is facing up, and then we are going to press the seam open. So just use your fingers to manipulate the seam open and then run your iron along that seam. Give it a second just to set, turn over and press. Okay, I'm going to talk about this whilst I press these because pressing seams open or in one direction in the quilting world is quite a polarizing topic. So some people are very anti-pressing open, other people are very anti-pressing to the side for some reason. I don't really mind. I'm quite happy to go with the flow. In previous videos, I have always pressed to the side because I found that it's easier to nest seams. However, as my skills as a quilter have gotten better, I have found that actually it's quite easy to nest seams when they are pressed open. Now, as I said, the reason we're pressing these open is because there is going to be lots of HSTs coming together, creating a little bit of bulk. And in order to help our block, A, be as accurate as possible, and also B, to be as flat as possible, sometimes we have to change our approach to things. If, however, you're looking at this thinking, no, I don't want to press my seams open, then absolutely fine. Do not let me tell you what to do. It's absolutely your choice in how you do your quilting. I'm just showing you what's working for me, and I completely understand if your preference is to press the side. If you're going to press the side though, set the seam on top, roll back, use your fingers in the seam and gently push up away from the seam, and then use your iron to open it. And be careful not to stretch the seam because these are very easy to distort because there is some bias in here, or biased edges, I mean not bias. When I first started doing pressed open seams, it did feel a bit unnatural to do them. Took a bit of getting used to, but I do find that the more I do it, the faster I get to it. And actually, sometimes I find when there is something on a bias edge, pressing the seam open can actually be helpful for avoiding distortion because I'm not pushing or prodding, even though I currently look like I'm pushing or prodding. Sometimes they just don't want to open. This fabric sticks together. And repeat your preferred or desired pressing method until you have done all 12 half square triangles. And then we're going to take these and we're going to trim these up. Another argument that people sometimes use against pressing seams open is that they claim that the seam will not be as strong as if they are pressed to the side and interlocking. And I confess I used to believe this myself, because it made sense to me that if the seam was open, it would be a point of weakness in the quilt. But having watched and made garments now for a while, garment seams are often pressed open, and garments have considerably more wear and tear. If you consider the wear and tear and pressure that's put on a shoulder seam in, say, a jacket or a shirt, that's more wear and tear than a quilt gets when you're just lying underneath the quilt. So to me, I'm not sure the argument that it weakens the seam makes sense. If they use it for garments in high stress areas, then surely it's fine for a quilt. So either way, this is what we're doing. Do how you like to do it. Now we're going to trim these. Now I am just going to show you this on one, because this is tedious to watch. But basically we are trimming these up to 3.5 inches square. So with the dark color on kind of top left, with a square ruler, get a square ruler because it does make life simpler. If it's the exact size that you're squaring up to, that's even better, but it doesn't really matter. I like a little masking tape ledge that runs along the 45-degree line, because it just gives me something to butt up into this seam, and then it helps me to keep it nice and straight. As a reminder, the first cut is not about sizing. The first cut is about getting a square edge. So I'm trimming off hardly anything, including those dog ears, and this gives me a straight edge. What you do have to make sure though is that down here on these sides that they are past the 3.5 inch line, because you don't want to end up with an HST that is too small. As I mentioned at the start of this video as well, if you are a beginner making half square triangles, you most definitely want to make your starting squares at least 1/2 inch bigger to give you more room to trim and work with. I'm very used to making half square triangles, so in my demonstrations I'm using just a little bit bigger, and you'll see in a second that I'm barely about to trim off 1/8 of an inch on each side. So make yours bigger, and that will give you space to practice. Particularly the smaller an HST gets, the smaller it is, the more fussy it is to make. Not impossible, just a little bit fussier. So give yourself as much chance of success by adjusting the size. So anyway, we have squared, nice square edge. Flip it round. Now, with my diagonal line, I am going to line up 3.5 here and the 3.5 there. This is on the 45-degree seam. You can see there's hardly anything going to be trimmed off here. Just make sure that this line is on the seam and that these lines are straight, and when you are happy, trim. I often don't like to go that way. I like to roll it backwards, because I have a habit of cutting the corner off my ruler, or chipping the corner. So I find sometimes it's helpful to go that way instead of going that way. And there we have a beautiful HST. Now just repeat this for all of these, squaring up to 3.5 inch and make a nice neat pile. Okay, now that we have trimmed all of our HSTs, it's time to lay the block out. So with our background square, this is the same in each quadrant. So I'm going to make a quadrant first to show you what I mean. Okay, so that's a quadrant. A quarter of the block. Same thing on yellow. Nope. Here's where you see my brain working. And then background square. And then this one goes here. And then this one fills in the gap. And minus the scrap, that is the ribbon star. So you can see why we press the seams open, because there's going to be bulk here, here, and here, and here. So we want to try and minimize. So by pressing the seams open, it's minimizing the bulk. Now we just use our normal construction methods to place these all right sides together, take them to the sewing machine, sew these together, chain piece, cut them apart, pressing all the seams open, and then we join the rows together. This is a good example, like there's a lot of bulk here. So rather than pushing it to one side to create a lump, we're flattening it out by pressing it open. And that will hopefully help the block to lay nice and flat. beautiful point, very happy. Again, this one has lots of bulk because it's got the 2 points coming together. Just give it a little smoosh with that iron to get it nice and flat. Okay, everything is pressed. Let's put the rows back together. Now you got 2 choices. You can either sew these together and these together to make squares, or you can just sew this into one column and then this into one column. Right, so I'm going to sew these into squares. That's my preferred choice. Now when it comes to pressing these, you just want to be careful. Make sure that you get the seam nice and flat underneath here, this point here, okay? Just giving it a little press because it is a little bulky. In this block, we have bulk here, 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 everywhere. So take your time pressing really nice and flat. That's beautifully flat. Really good. Something I didn't mention, or rather forgot to mention, was you want to pin these when you put them together. I forgot. I think I left my brain in the other room today. Put your pins in to hold things in place to make sure the intersections line up, because you want crisp points in the middle and you want crisp points here. Mine's just a tiny bit off, but when you press these you can push down with your iron just to help it get nice and flat. Notice I'm going this way. I'm not diagonally doing the iron and making sure I'm going with the grain so that I'm not stretching the bias. These have turned out beautifully. Very happy. Last steps, join this to this, this to this, and then in the middle, press your seams open. Use pins because we want to make sure that things line up. So, place these together. I put a pin in here. And what I'm doing is putting the pin through the seam and then putting it into the middle of the back seam and just holding it. There we go. So you can see the pins in the seam. Same here. There we are. Ready to sew. When it comes to pressing, there is a lot of bulk here. So you may find when you are sewing, also when you're sewing this, that you have to go really nice and slow over that seam so that it doesn't push, because it's so easy for that seam to move. So yeah, that's just a fraction off, but it's really bulky here at this intersection. Pressing it open is a bit like spinning the seams on a pinwheel block to try and get it to sit flat. Good hot iron, or an iron as hot as your fabric that you're using can handle, will make this easier. And I like to just press with a little bit of pressure, smashing it to get it flat. But actually that's not too bad when you see it. And I'm just adjusting, making sure that it's okay. If it's off, just feeling a little bit off square, just give it a gentle tug to get it back to square, but really focusing on getting that seam nice and flat. You can see this one is a little bit better. It just takes a little bit of work. Definitely recommend pinning that. And when you're going to sew this next row together, definitely recommend getting pins in here to make sure that this doesn't move because it's thick. And also when you sew this, be careful with your sewing machine because of the bulk. It will most likely wobble a little bit and your quarter inch seam will get a little bit bigger. Go slow over this because otherwise you may find that it turns out a wee bitty wonky. And then I'm just going to pop a pin in the center just in case. We don't want any mishaps. We also don't want to burn the table with that iron, so we're going to turn it off. Just give it a little press. No, we haven't sewn it yet, but this will also just help those seams to be nice and flat for sewing. Okay, to the sewing machine. Okay, so we're going to press this. Now when you saw me sew, I really slowed down here because the bulk, it felt like it was starting to do this as it fed through the machine, pushing it away as opposed to pulling it through. So really slowed down, took my time, lots of stabilizing with hands. One other thing I want to point out is that when you're sewing, underneath sometimes can get pushed. The presser plate can sometimes push these seams in the wrong direction. So just make sure both sides are laying nice and flat. I'm going to give this a good old press. It's one of the downsides of blocks that are made with lots of half square triangles They are beautiful to look at, but they come with the challenge of bulk. And it's one of these things that when you make complicated blocks, more complicated blocks than this actually, it becomes more and more bulkage to deal with. But take your time, go slow, lots of pressing. Don't be afraid to use pressure with the iron, a bit like a tailor's clap to help that seam. It will eventually go flat. Lots of heat. Just be careful that you don't push the other seams in other directions. Let's just take a moment to marvel at how nice and neat the back looks. I always think pressed open seams on blocks looks really nice. Creates this strange kind of frame around them, which I think is very nice. So now the moment of truth. How well did Tom do with his seams? Ooh, not too shabby, he says. So you can see, this is the one that we had a little bit of issue with. It's a tiny bit off, but it's okay, that's good enough. This is good. This is a tiny bit off, but it's okay. We're going for good. There's no such thing as perfection. Good enough. I'm very happy with how this has turned out, and I hope you will be happy with how yours turns out too. So just remember, lots of pressing, take your time, go slow over those bulky seams, pin and give it a little press before you sew it. That can also help as well. If you're not happy with anything, by all means, unpick and sew it again. You know, you get many chances to try this. And I actually did. I took this seam out and redid it because it was just not happy in the sewing machine. So there. Anyway, looks good. I hope you enjoyed making that. And that was the ribbon star. Okay, so that was the instructions for the block, and it really is dead simple. The hardest part of this block is managing the bulkage in the seams, because you're basically making half square triangles, which we've already made 3 blocks worth of half square triangles already. So that's easy. The half square triangles are a little smaller, which does make them a little fussier to work with, but not impossible. These are still, you know, 3.5 inches square, so that's still a decent size. If these were 1.5 inches, then yeah, they would be tricky to work with. I definitely recommend, if you're a beginner though, making sure you give yourself 1/2 inch to 1 inch more on the blocks that make the half square triangles up, because it will give you more space for trimming. And my demos, I always go with the minimum amount that I can get away with for fabric wastage. But as a beginner, I would often add 1 inch to my half square triangle squares before sewing them, just so that if I mucked up, if my 1/4 inch seam wasn't good enough, if my pressing was a bit squiffy, I had some leverage to work with. So please don't feel that you have to go with my sizes. Give yourself 1/2 inch to 1 inch bigger to help you out. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that when you're sewing over these bulky seams, it's so easy for the sewing machine to scrunch things up and push them in the right direction. So lots of pins, take your time, slow down. Some sewing machines, they have a kind of button that helps the foot to get over lumpy, bumpy seams. You might need to do some of that. You may find it helpful, and I certainly did when I was doing it, is once I've pinned it, is to take the iron and press it, and not like press it like you would press the seam, like press down with the hot iron to try and flatten the seams. And I certainly found that when I did that, it went through the sewing machine a lot easier. So try that out. Don't be afraid to unpick the seams if it's not to your satisfaction. You know, unpick and sew it again. I had to unpick a seam because, well, actually I had to unpick 2 because I sewed it the wrong way around the first time. And then the second time I just wasn't happy. The point was cut off and they were too far apart, and it didn't look good enough. Not aiming for perfection though, remember, we're just aiming for good enough. And so I think that with those little tweaks, my block turned out very nice. I gave it a lot of pressing to get it nice and flat. So don't be frightened that it might take 2 or 3 minutes of pressing to get this to sit flat, but once it's flat, it's just beautiful. I so enjoy it. Now let's have a look at some quilts that we can make using this block. Alrighty then, our first example is the simplest example of the 3. This is just the basic block arranged in rows and columns. Now this is one of these quilt blocks that creates secondary patterns, so this is very pleasing on the eye. And you can see there's almost a secondary block that appears like a plus sign on point. So this is very nice and I like this, and if you were to add the border, same colour as the background around this, this would make this float in the middle and it would look beautiful. So that's what you can do with just the block on its own. Now let's look at what we can do when we play around a little bit with placement. Now, second example. Still just using the block as it is, however this time I have added rows of sashing and between each of the blocks. So rows and columns of sashing, and then I have put a cornerstone in between the corners of each block. and it creates this lovely secondary pattern. So you can see the stars, but then when you look, you can see the plus signs that look like they have an economy block in the middle. So this is very nice. I very much like this as well. When I did this, I did debate whether to continue the cornerstone theme in the outside border, and I did, and I'm glad I did because it looks really good. But again, this is dead simple. This is just the ribbon star block with sashing. So simple, but look how beautiful that turned out. Now for our third example, we're getting a little fancy. So again, this is still just the block and sashing of the block, but starting to be strategic and thinking about the placement. So what we have done is we have continued with just the block and then the sashing with the cornerstones. However, now I have rotated the blocks so that you can see all the blues line up, all the yellows line up, and we get this alternating blue, yellow secondary pattern. And then what I've done is where all the blues are coming together, you can see I've put a blue cornerstone, and where all the yellows come together, I've put the yellow cornerstone. I did remove the cornerstones from the border because I wanted this to float, so it's just the plain background as the border. Now I very, very much want to make this quilt. I don't know why, I just really like this. I was surprised at how nicely this turned out. I mean, it's really very simple. It's just the block rotated and then some cornerstones, but I just love how this looks. I really do. So it's a lot of fun, and it goes to show that you can take the basic block, add a little bit of sashing, add some cornerstones, add some borders and things like that, and come up with a beautiful quilt very simply and very easily. So I hope you like those examples. I'm trying so hard not to make number 3, but I really want to because it's just so nice. And just imagine this in orange and navy, and now I want to make it. So anyway, hope you enjoyed those, and I hope you find those helpful in your quilting endeavors. Okay, that was the ribbon star. And yeah, I'm now in the stage where I'm trying to talk myself out of wanting to make a quilt using this block. And I'm going to end up with like more quilts than I can ever make in my lifetime on my list, the way things are going. But you never know, this might make it into the actual list that I make. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found it helpful. It is a fun little block, and it's going to look great as part of our sampler quilt. Now, if you're wondering what the sampler quilt is all about, and you're kind of like, how do I get involved? What do I do? Go and check out the link in the description below. It will take you to the page on my website, which has all the information, fabric instructions, and all of that jazz. And then you can sign up with your email address, and it will send you the cutting instructions for all the blocks. And you will then also start to get all the emails for the blocks as they come out. So this is on block 4, so you'll get 4 emails once you sign up if you haven't already signed up. So next month's block, we're making the churn dash block. Fabulous, versatile block. Dead simple to make. You're going to love that one if you have never made it before. It's one of my favorite blocks. Yes, I know every block is my favorite, but that's one of my favorites. So anywho, ribbon star, done. I hope you enjoyed that. If you found the video helpful, it does help my channel if you can give me a little thumbs up, and if you subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when the next video in this series comes up. Tag me on social media, the ColourBlind Quilter, using the hashtag #BehindTheBlocks2, so I can follow along and see the blocks that you're making. People are making some beautiful blocks, and I love the colours and choices that you've been using for them. So I love seeing them, so tag me on social media. If you don't use social media, send me an email, hello@thecolorblindquilter.com. I'd love to see what you're working on. So, enough rambling. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you next month for the churn dash. Take care and happy sewing.